My intuition tells me that consciousness somehow emerges. Your brain and my brain and everybody's brain is made up of molecules and atoms in particular configurations. If the particles don't have that, how is it that by putting a lot of particles together, you do yield an inner world of sights and smells and emotions, this inner world that we all have playing out inside of our heads? Where does it come from? Maybe the particles do have some kind of version of consciousness, a little bit of consciousness in the electron, in the quark, in the proton. This chair, from this perspective, would embody a certain rudimentary kind of consciousness because the ingredients themselves would embody that. If that's all that consciousness is, then you pretty inviolably come to the conclusion that there is no free will. Religion's a beautiful, really spectacular invention of the human mind. Of course, physics can allow for God.
It's a great honor having you here. And my opening question to you is, don't you think that we were not programmed to understand the universe, but just only to survive?
Absolutely. Our brains, like the rest of our bodies, like every species on planet Earth, is here because it survived, and it survived because survival of the fittest. We evolve over time to have the capacities that allow us to get the next meal, or to find shelter, or to avoid a predator. That's why we are here. And our brains do that by finding patterns in the external world. Because if you can see a pattern out there, you've got a leg up in the battle for survival. If you can maybe predict with some certainty what's going to happen next while your competitor can't, you're more likely to win, to survive. That's why we're here.
So as a physicist, you are fighting with nature?
I wouldn't say that we're fighting with nature. What I would say is, once our brains gained the capacity to recognize patterns that aided survival, that capacity then went overboard. It evolved to a place where it could spot patterns that are irrelevant to survival. And then as we began to conquer the natural world, where we didn't have to spend all our time gathering fruit and nuts or throwing a spear at an antelope, when we had enough time, we could use that pattern recognition capacity to start to think about things like the pattern of the motion of the planets, the pattern of the motion of objects that we throw, or even then the pattern of the motion of the electron in the atom, or the pattern of the energy that comes out of the accretion disk around a black hole. These are just extensions of our capacity to recognize patterns that were at first in the service of survival, but now we have not fought against nature. We've leveraged that capacity to go even further.
What about the molecules? Can molecules be involved in that natural selection process?
I think molecular Darwinism, as we often call it, is a vital part of how the world has evolved. Many of us, when we learn about evolution by natural selection in school, at least here in the United States, it's always at the level of living systems. Living systems, they have progeny. The progeny won't have exactly the same characteristics as their parents. And those new characteristics which aid in survival, they will spread widely because the bearer of those characteristics will have a better chance of living to the age of reproduction. Now, that's only at the level of living systems. There's a version of that that happens at the level of molecules. Molecules can have children, so to speak. They can have progeny. Molecules can learn the trick of replication. And once a molecule can make a copy of itself, we recognize that no copying process is ever perfect. There will always be mutations, slightly different molecules, and those mutations that aid in the process of making more replicants, they will spread widely. So the molecular demographics will become dominated by those molecules that can reproduce swifter, faster, with greater economy and greater stability. So in that sense, molecules themselves fight other molecules. chemical combat that ultimately yields refined molecules, and those are the molecules that ultimately make up living systems.
What's about the entropy in the universe? Can the actions, the molecules increase entropy in the universe?
Yeah, every physical process, by and large, except for very unlikely events, results in an increase in entropy, for the basic reason that entropy is simply a measure of the number of ways that a given system can be realized. And if there are more ways that a system can be realized, it's more likely that that configuration will come to be. And so over time, entropy increases at every level, at the level of molecules, at the level of living systems, at the level of the universe. Now, it may not always seem that way, because we can do things that seem to decrease the amount of entropy, decrease the amount of disorder. We can order a system using our brains and using our volitional capacities. But if you take into account the amount of entropy that our bodies create in the process of yielding that ordered system, then the overall entropy always increases over time.
Entropy and evolution of the universe are what mainly determine operations in the universe, all operations in the universe?
Yeah, when I think about the dominant forces at work guiding the cosmic evolution, I do think of it in terms of entropy and evolution. Entropy is this drive toward ever greater disorder. Evolution is this drive toward ever greater refined systems that are able to replicate with greater capacity. And so they kind of seem like at opposite ends of the spectrum. Entropy driving us toward disorder, evolution in a sense driving us toward order. Now, in a sense therefore, these two forces, they kind of battle against each other during the unfolding of the cosmos. Ultimately, entropy wins. If you look at the far future of the universe as we can understand it using our mathematical equations that describe the laws of physics, it's pretty clear that every ordered system in the universe ultimately decays, ultimately falls apart. Yes.
Every single system?
Every single system. So stars ultimately run out of nuclear fuel and either explode or turn to a simmering, smoldering mass. They lose that beautiful ordered structure that gives rise to heat and light that comes out of a star during its living system. Even black holes. Ultimately, Stephen Hawking taught us
mystery of black hole.
A big mystery of black holes, but there's some aspects that we understand well. And Stephen Hawking taught us that black holes emit radiation slowly, but they emit radiation over time. So their configuration ultimately gives rise to a bath of particles, disordered particles that waft through the universe. So every system that may embody order at a given cosmological epoch ultimately disintegrates, falls apart, gives rise to a disorderly end product.
We have a mystery of black hole. We'll back to the topic, but we have also mystery of human consciousness. All we know about the human consciousness is that I have consciousness, you have consciousness, this director chair does not. That's only one thing we know about the consciousness.
Well, there would be people who would debate even the statement that the chair doesn't have consciousness. I agree. I don't think that it does. But when we try to understand the basis of consciousness, we run up against what's known as the hard problem. And the hard problem is simply that your brain and my brain and everybody's brain is made up of molecules and atoms in particular configurations. If the individual particles don't have inner worlds of subjective experience, conscious self-awareness, if the particles don't have that, how is it that by putting a lot of particles together, you do yield an inner world of sights and smells and emotions, this inner world that we all have playing out inside of our heads? Where does it come from? Some have suggested that the starting point of that puzzle is incorrect. Maybe the particles do have some kind of version of consciousness, some kind of proto-consciousness, a little bit of consciousness in the electron, in the quark, in the protons, and maybe that little bit inside of things. And therefore, this chair, from this perspective, would embody a certain rudimentary kind of consciousness because the ingredients themselves would embody that. This is not an approach that has convinced me, but I understand why people introduce this idea, because I cannot answer the question of how can a collection of mindless particles gain mindfulness? How does that happen? Nobody can answer that question.
For you, it's more physics, biology, or chemistry?
Well, my view, which comes from years of thinking about these puzzles and my intuition as a physicist, my intuition tells me that consciousness somehow emerges, an emergent phenomenon, when you have particles, molecules, atoms in a sufficiently coherent arrangement. But if you ask me, how does that happen? I remain at a loss, because I don't know, and nobody knows the mechanism by which consciousness emerges from orderly structures. My guess is that one day we will understand how that happens. But there are some who say that's too optimistic a viewpoint. You can't get consciousness from something that's not conscious. You can't take a bunch of particles, each of which has no consciousness whatsoever, put them together and have consciousness emerge. Some people feel that very, very strongly.
Maybe consciousness is born in the quantum phenomenon. We spent so much time with Roger Penrose. He deeply believes that the human consciousness is born in quantum level, in a quantum phenomenon, deeper inside the human brain.
Yeah, I have no doubt that quantum physics in some way, shape, or form is important to consciousness, because quantum physics is important to the way physical things in our universe behave. And those physical things include, of course, the particles that make up the atom, and the atoms that make up the molecules, and the molecules that make up the cells, and the cells that make up the brain, which somehow has conscious awareness. So quantum mechanics has to be, at some level, part of the story. But I do not think, or at least I do not see any evidence, that the structure of quantum mechanics per se necessarily yields consciousness. To me, it's more. It's the laws of physics together with the orderly structures that are the substrate within which consciousness takes place. And so I don't see a direct route from quantum mechanics to consciousness, at least not in the way that I think Roger has imagined it.
I remember my interview with Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, and I need to ask you about free will. Do you understand the difference between free will and consciousness? Professor Sapolsky deeply believed that there is no free will. We are biological machines. Everything is determined by the cells, by molecules, by atoms. Do you feel the difference between consciousness and will?
Yes. So the question of free will hinges on your perspective regarding consciousness. If you believe, as I do, but I do not have proof, but if you believe that consciousness is ultimately reducible to physical processes, biological processes, chemical processes, if that's all that consciousness is, then you pretty inviolably come to the conclusion that there is no free will. Why is there no free will?
It's so sad.
It is sad in a way, but in a way it's actually, I think, quite liberating. But again, the argument is, if the ingredients from which consciousness emerges, the particles, the molecules, the atoms, if they are governed by physical law, you and I and nobody else has the ability to intercede in the lawful progression, the lawful behavior of those particles. So when you, in your mind, make a decision or have a thought, ultimately, if that conscious awareness is nothing but molecules moving one way or another, you can't control those motions, and therefore you can't control what's happening inside your head.
You mean that we are not determined to answer the question what consciousness is?
Well, it depends what you mean by determined. So there's two kinds of determination within physics, and they've been used in different periods of time. In the old classical physics, prior to quantum physics, the idea of having a determined system is you tell me the state of the system right now, the positions and the velocities of all the particles, and I'll simply use the laws of physics to predict what that system will be like 5 minutes later, or an hour later, or a year later. The initial conditions and the laws of physics determine how things will be, period, end of story. That's classical physics. Quantum physics, which has supplanted classical physics, says something a little bit differently. It says, tell me how things are now as best as possible, describe the state of the system, and I will use the laws of quantum physics to predict the likelihood that things will be one way or another way still in the future. You can only predict probabilities, but those probabilities are just as determined in quantum physics as the outputs were determined in classical physics. It's just you're determining something else. So to my mind, you can sort of have your cake and eat it. People worry, if I don't have free will, does that mean you can predict what I'm going to say in 2 seconds? Answer is actually no. The best you could do is predict the probability that I'd say one thing or another still. And so there's an open quality to the future in quantum physics that you would not have in classical physics. So yes, I do not believe that I have free will, but I also understand that you can't use the laws of physics to predict with 100% certainty what I will do, because you can only predict probabilities of one or another outcome.
What about the human thoughts? I remember your own quote that human thoughts itself, it's a lifetime limitation in the universe. What does it mean?
Well, if you believe, as I do, that thoughts are physical processes, that there's no structure beyond the physical that somehow is the place where thoughts originate and take place, I'm not going to go to any of those ideas. I don't even know what they mean. So if I think of thought as a physical process, every physical process results in an increase in entropy.
Energy.
Ooh, a little bit different. Every thought and every physical process requires energy.
Yep.
But the output of the process through which that energy is used is to increase entropy. The amount of energy can stay fixed, but the energy degrades over time. And that degraded energy is what we mean by disorder or entropy. The reason why this is important is the following. Right now, as we're talking, I am producing a lot of entropy, hopefully not in the ideas that I'm communicating, but rather because I am giving off heat. I am emitting waste to the environment. And if you had the right instrument, you'd see the infrared light coming off of my head. That is turning energy into less useful energy. That infrared radiation is hard to make use of. That is what we mean by entropy. In this room is very good at being able to absorb the heat, the waste, the entropy I'm producing. But in the far future, as the temperature of the universe comes down, you can argue convincingly with mathematics that there will come a point when the universe can't absorb the entropy, it can't absorb the heat that thought itself creates. At that point, if a thinking being thinks one more thought, they will burn up in the entropic waste produced by the process of thought itself. They will die. There will be no further capacity for thought to take place.
Human beings determine the entropy.
Human beings create entropy.
Create entropy.
Yes. As does every other living system, as does every other physical process in the universe.
How do you define the truth? What truth is for you?
Well, I think truth comes in a number of varieties. There is something that I like to think of as objective truth, which speaks to the qualities of the external world that we attempt to describe using mathematics, be it the general theory of relativity, be it quantum mechanics. These are mathematical approaches to try to get at the truth of the physical processes that take place in the universe that have been holding sway since the Big Bang, giving rise to stars and galaxies and planets, and on this planet living systems. There's also another variety of truth, which is a more internal, subjective truth. These are the truths that every human being holds.
Truth.
Yes, these are the truths that every human being holds within their mind. There are things that deeply matter to me, my family, my parents, the things that I spend my time on, my perspective on the political situation. These are vital truths to me as a human being, but they're not objective. Not everybody will agree that these are fundamental truths of the universe. They're things that matter to me as an individual human. Often we get these mixed up. Things that people think of as objective truths oftentimes are just subjective truths that matter to them. And having a clear understanding of the truths that are external and out there versus the ones that are internal is a vital distinction to make.
I ask you because I found your tweet published maybe 2-3 days ago about the mathematics and ideas that you think that we can discover mathematical idea. It's a fully different approach that represents all mathematicians that I know.
Yes, most mathematicians
because mostly people think that mathematical idea exist. Yeah. They are. Who created, nobody knows that, but they are. You think that we can discover mathematical ideas?
Yeah, I would use a slightly different word. I would say we invent mathematical ideas. We don't discover them. To discover them would suggest that they're out there waiting to be found. You just need to unearth them. Somebody else created them, or the universe created them, and they're out there. And I don't think there could be any possibility that this is true. Mathematics is a language that we humans developed in order to find a very quantitative and accurate approach to embodying the patterns that we see in the external world. We invent mathematics.
But maybe that language, there is only tool to understand something that is.
That's how most mathematicians will describe it. But the theorems and the proofs that mathematicians proudly publish in papers and journals around the world, it's not that they don't have value, but they are truths that emerge within the language of mathematics that we invent. There is no meaning to these statements, to these theorems, to these proofs without the language of mathematics itself, and we invent that language. And so take the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We invent the idea of a triangle. There's no real triangle in the external world. We invent the idea of a line. We invent the idea of a right angle. There's no real right angle in the external. They're close to right angles, but we invent the ideas and then we find interesting features about the concepts that we invent. Now, most mathematicians recoil at this idea because somehow the validity and value of what they're doing for many rests upon finding external truths, things that are out there that will always be true. And my answer to that is the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared plus c squared, it only has meaning when it's resonant inside of a head that can understand it. And in the far future, when there are no thinking structures left, when there's nobody able to think anything at all, the Pythagorean theorem will not exist. Where will it be if it's not resonating inside of a mind that can understand it? To say that math is out there, independent of us, has as little validity as saying that there is a deity out there, independent of us doing things. And if you're willing to go in that direction, then I believe you're undercutting the logical structure of the insights that we're able to gain about who we are and what we do.
Can physics allow for God evidence?
Of course, physics can allow for God. It could be that there is a God. I can't prove that there isn't a God, just like I can't prove that mathematics isn't out there. The best that anyone can do is marshal the most convincing argument based upon things that we know about, things that we've seen, that we've observed, the data that we have. There is no data. There is no evidence that I've ever seen that gives me any confidence that the idea of a God is real. That is not proof that God is not real. It's merely giving you insight into my thinking and the thinking of many others as well as to why this might not be true. But could it be that there's a God out there and carefully has arranged things so that there won't be any evidence, so that the God has hidden their role in the world and just maybe given clues that only the world's priests and imams and rabbis can find? Maybe, but I don't find that a plausible way of looking at the world. I've found that I can have conversations with anyone and we can leave that conversation feeling good, because my approach to the world is not to undercut someone's position, but rather to hear them and to see the degree to which their perspective can be integrated into my own. So unlike some of my colleagues who say religion should be wiped off the face of the earth, that it's the most egregious and awful result of civilization, I don't feel that way at all. I find religion to be a beautiful structure that speaks to who we are and what matters to us and the ideals that we have. Of course, religion can be used for bad, just the way nuclear understanding can be used for bad or good. And so religion as a tool can have some very negative consequences. But viewed in the most positive light, religion's a beautiful, really spectacular invention of the human mind. The thing that we're most terrified about as human beings is our mortality. How wonderful to invent a structure whereby our death is not the end of our existence. Our death is merely a step within a much larger story. And so that's a very beautiful way of quelling the existential anxiety that comes with mortality awareness. That, to me, is an internal truth for those who believe it. It is not an objective external truth, but internal truths matter. They're valuable.
There is a William James book from 1902. Do you know that?
Yes, I do. Varieties of religious experience.
Yeah, why we need religion, why we need to be under control, superpower.
Yeah. Absolutely. William James is a hero of mine, because here you have a scientist trying to understand the human condition through the lens of rational thought and rational gathering of data and rational evaluation of people's experiences. And William James came out of that experience, understanding the worldwide experience of religion and religious phenomenon from very different perspectives, and came with a very beautiful perspective on how religion meets certain needs that we have, how religion serves certain purposes for we as human beings crawling around the surface of a nondescript rock, orbiting around a nondescript star in the outskirts of an ordinary galaxy. Who wouldn't suffer from anxiety? Who wouldn't suffer for terror and fear to be thrust into that reality? And if religion can help quell those fears, if religion can tell a larger story that can make an individual feel that their life matters in the grander scheme of things, then yeah, that's a powerful structure and it's a powerful role for this idea that we have invented called religion.